The wind was a blade, sharp and unforgiving, tearing across the skeletal branches of the high plains and whipping Alara's threadbare shawl around her shoulders like a shroud. Dust, gritty and cold, coated her tongue and stung her eyes, blurring the already desolate landscape into shades of ochre and gray. Each step was a leaden weight against the indifferent earth, a testament to sheer, bone-deep weariness. Her boots, cracked and worn, offered little protection against the frozen ground that promised nothing but hardship. She clutched the meager bundle against her chest, the fabric thin, offering no real warmth, only the illusion of something to hold on to in this vast, empty space. It had been days since she'd seen another soul, weeks since the last vestige of her old life had crumbled into dust and ash behind her. They had driven her out. The whispers, the pointed fingers, the judgment heavy as stone. She could still hear them, a phantom chorus echoing in the wind's mournful cry. Unfit, tarnished, better gone. And so she was gone, cast out into the wilderness, seeking some edge of the world where their judgment couldn't reach. She knew she was nearing his territory. Everyone knew about Silas. The stories clung to the wind like burrs, sharp and persistent. He was a phantom, a shadow, a force of nature as untamed and dangerous as the land itself. They said he had a temper that could shatter bone, a past steeped in violence, eyes that held the coldness of the grave. He lived alone, shunned and shunning, in some remote corner of this unforgiving country. The sensible would skirt his land by miles, even days of hard travel. Alara wasn't sensible anymore. Sensibility had gotten her here, shivering and alone, facing the prospect of freezing before the next sunrise. Desperation was a potent, blinding force. It gnawed at her resolve, whispering that any shelter, any warmth, even that offered by a feared man, was better than the alternative. She had heard snippets, contradictory tales, that he killed trespassers on sight, that he simply let the land claim them, that he was a myth conjured to keep folk away. She didn't know what to believe, but the biting wind and the gnawing emptiness in her belly were undeniably real. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, shallow and painful. The sun was beginning its reluctant descent, bleeding weak colors across the bruised sky. Soon, the cold would deepen its grip, becoming an enemy she couldn't outrun. Her legs ached, her head pounded, and her heart felt like a small, frightened bird trapped in her chest. She had to find shelter, anywhere, even if it meant risking the wrath of the most feared man in the territory. A low ridge rose ahead, offering a meager break against the wind. Perhaps there, tucked away, would be a rock overhang, a shallow cave. Or perhaps, if the stories were true, his cabin lay beyond it. A wave of nausea washed over her. Fear, cold and pure, tightened its icy grip around her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to brave the open plains, to gamble on finding refuge elsewhere. But the path behind her was empty, leading only to the ghosts of her past and the certain, creeping death of exposure. She was adrift in a hostile world, her only compass the desperate need to survive. The bundle she held contained little: a change of clothes, a tin cup, a handful of dried beans, a single tarnished locket. It was the sum total of her earthly possessions, a meager anchor in the storm of her life. She had lost everything else: her home, her standing, her husband, her future. The locket, a tiny silver heart, was the only tangible link to a life that felt 1,000 years away. She pressed it against her cheek, the cold metal a stark contrast to her chilled skin. It offered no comfort, only a reminder of what was gone. She stumbled forward, the ridge looming closer. The air grew colder still, the wind's howl rising in pitch. The landscape seemed to close in, becoming more rugged, more isolated. This was his domain. She could feel it in the oppressive silence, in the way the land seemed to hold its breath. It was a place of shadows and secrets, guarded by a man forged by the same unforgiving elements. Her vulnerability felt absolute, a raw wound exposed to the elements. She was a trespasser, weak and unwanted, stumbling into the lair of a predator. Yet, a flicker of stubborn defiance ignited within her. She had faced down the cruelty of her own kind and survived. Perhaps, just perhaps, the wilderness and the man who ruled it were less cruel than the so-called civilized world she had left behind. It was a desperate thought, born of exhaustion and dwindling hope, but it was all she had. She reached the base of the ridge, the wind momentarily baffled by the stone wall. A faint scent reached her nostrils, wood smoke, faint but distinct. It was nearby. He was nearby. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet of the wild. She swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making it a painful effort. There was no turning back now. The cold was too deep, the night too close. Survival instinct, primal and unyielding, pushed her forward. She began to climb the gentle slope, her eyes scanning for any sign, any shape against the fading light that might betray the location of his dwelling. The stories spun themselves in her mind, tales of sudden violence, of a man with no mercy. They were a chilling counterpoint to the desperate hope for shelter. She reached the crest of the ridge, and below, nestled in a small, protected hollow, was a cabin. Stone and rough-hewn logs, solid and low to the ground, hunkered against the elements. A thin plume of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the frozen twilight. It looked utterly isolated, miles from anywhere, exactly the kind of place a man like Silas would choose. Hesitation warred with desperation. Every rational thought screamed danger. But the cold was a more immediate, tangible threat than the feared man. She could face Silas, perhaps beg, perhaps plead, perhaps meet a swift, brutal end. She could not face the night on the open ground. Gathering the last reserves of her courage, she began the slow, careful descent towards the cabin, her eyes fixed on the wisp of smoke, a fragile tendril connecting her to the possibility of life. The silence was broken only by the wind and the crunch of her boots on the frozen earth. She was acutely aware of her exposure, a small, solitary figure in the vast, indifferent landscape, walking towards the unknown. As she drew nearer, the cabin resolved into clearer detail. It was sturdier than it had appeared from the ridge, built with purpose against the relentless elements. A single window, small and dark, offered no hint of what lay within. A lean-to was attached to one side, partially collapsing but offering some measure of shelter. There was no sign of movement outside, no barking dog, no welcoming light from the window. Just the smoke, a silent invitation or a warning. The air grew heavier with the scent of wood smoke, rich and promising. Her stomach twisted with hunger and fear. She stopped a few yards from the cabin door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure anyone inside must hear it. Her breath plumed, visible in the cold air. She was utterly exposed, vulnerable. There was no hiding now. Raising a trembling hand, she hesitated. Knocking felt absurd, formal in this wild place, on the door of a man rumored to be little more than a beast. But standing there, frozen, was pointless. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she rapped lightly on the rough wood. The sound seemed deafeningly loud in the stillness. Silence stretched, long and tense. She waited, every muscle tensed, ready to flee, though she knew there was nowhere to go. Nothing happened. Had he not heard? Was he even inside? Or was he simply ignoring her, letting her stand there until the cold drove her away or claimed her? She knocked again, a little louder this time, her voice barely a whisper as she called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." Still silence. Despair began to creep in, colder than the air. Perhaps the stories were true and he was a ghost. Or perhaps he was watching her from the dark window, deciding her fate. Just as she was about to turn away, conceding defeat to the man and the mountain, the door creaked open, slowly, deliberately. A figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light within. He was tall, broad-shouldered, imposing. Even in the gloom, the sheer physicality of him was evident. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, a silent, formidable presence. The air crackled with tension. Alara felt a fresh wave of fear, sharp and visceral. This was Silas. She knew it with a certainty that went beyond the stories. His reputation preceded him like a chilling wind. She couldn't make out his features in the shadow, but the sense of coiled power, of dangerous stillness, radiated from him. She swallowed again, finding her voice, though it was still weak. "Please," she said, her words catching on the cold air. I am lost. I have nowhere to go. I need shelter. Just for the night." He remained silent, utterly still. Alara felt scrutinized, judged by his silent gaze. Was this how it ended? A swift end at his hand? Or simply being turned away to face the elements? The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. She felt the cold seeping deeper into her bones, a constant, aching reminder of her plight. Just when she thought he would slam the door in her face, or worse, he shifted slightly. A low, gravelly voice, rough as river stones, finally broke the silence. No room, it was curt, final, devoid of any warmth or pity. Her heart sank. She had expected cruelty, violence even, but the simple, blunt refusal felt like a death sentence. Tears pricked at her eyes, born of exhaustion and despair. "Please," she repeated, her voice thick. "I will freeze. I have nothing, no one. Just a corner by the fire." She hugged her bundle tighter, a futile gesture against the overwhelming cold. The figure in the doorway didn't respond immediately. The silence returned, fraught with her desperate plea and his implacable refusal. She could feel the warmth emanating from the open door, a cruel contrast to the biting air outside. It was so close, yet impossibly far. She watched his shadowed form, trying to discern any flicker of Yoyur, any hint of something other than indifference. There was none. He was a wall, unyielding and impassive. She thought of the stories again, the ones that painted him as a monster. Perhaps they weren't exaggerated. Perhaps he truly had no humanity left. Despair threatened to engulf her. She couldn't stand here any longer. The cold was winning. With a heavy heart, she took a stumbling step back, preparing to turn and face the long, freezing night. It was futile. She wouldn't last until dawn. As she began to turn, the low voice spoke again, cutting through the wind's lament. "Lean-to's got a roof. Ain't much. Wind gets through." He didn't move, didn't open the door wider, but the words hung in the air, a grudging, minimal concession. It wasn't the warmth of the cabin, but it was shelter from the direct wind and snow, if it came. It was something. Hope, tiny and fragile, fluttered back into her chest. It was a chance. She looked back at the dark shape in the doorway. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. He gave no acknowledgement, no nod, no further word. He simply stood there for another long moment, and then the door creaked shut, plunging her back into the near-total darkness of the hollow, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and the sound of the relentless wind. He hadn't helped her, not truly, but he hadn't driven her away. It was a small mercy, granted by a man feared for his lack of mercy. She turned towards the lean-to, a rickety structure of logs and brush, barely visible in the fading light. It offered a low roof open to the elements on three sides, but better than nothing. She made her way towards it, her legs heavy with exhaustion and the fading remnants of her terror. As she settled into the meager shelter, huddling against the cold ground, she couldn't shake the image of the silent, imposing figure in the doorway. Silas. He was real, and she was on his land, under his roof, however precarious. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was tempered now by a sliver of something else: relief at escaping the worst of the wind, and a profound, unsettling curiosity about the man who had offered this strange, minimal reprieve. The night was long and bitterly cold, even within the partial shelter of the lean-to. The wind howled relentlessly, finding every gap in the makeshift walls, carrying with it the biting chill of the high country. Alara huddled into her thin clothes, the small bundle beneath her head offering little comfort. Sleep was a fitful, distant prospect, chased away by the cold and the persistent hum of fear that vibrated beneath her skin. She could see the dark shape of the cabin nearby, a silent, brooding presence in the night. Was he awake? Was he listening? The thought was unsettling. She imagined him inside, warm by a fire, indifferent to her plight just yards away. Yet he hadn't sent her away completely. That single, grudging offer of the lean-to felt enormous in its smallness, a fragile thread connecting her to the possibility of survival. She focused on that, clinging to it like a lifeline. As the hours crawled by, punctuated by the wind's mournful cries, Alara found herself observing the cabin, noting the solidness of its structure, the way it seemed to melt into the landscape, belonging there as much as the rocks and the wind-scoured trees. It was a fortress, built by hand, a testament to resilience in a brutal environment. Like the man, perhaps, she tried to reconcile the stories of his cruelty with the minimal act of allowing her this poor shelter. It didn't fit, or perhaps it did in a twisted way. Perhaps his cruelty was a refined thing, not swift but lingering, letting her suffer the cold rather than offering warmth. But then, why offer anything at all? He could have simply ignored her knock. He could have met her at the door with a rifle. He hadn't. The puzzle of Silas began to occupy her mind, a distraction from the gnawing cold. Who was he, really? Why did he live alone? Why was he so feared? The stories were lurid, focused on violence and death, but stories often grew wilder in the retelling. What was the truth buried beneath the legend? As dawn approached, painting the sky in icy shades of pink and gray, the wind finally began to abate, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural after the night's fury. Alara was stiff, aching, and numb with cold, but she was alive. She cautiously emerged from the lean-to, her movements slow and painful. Smoke still rose from the chimney, a more robust plume now. He was awake. Her fear returned, sharp and immediate. What would happen now? Would he tell her to leave? Would he ignore her again? She needed water desperately. Her mouth was dry and cracked. She scanned the area around the cabin. There was a small, frozen creek bed nearby, marked by stunted willows. The water would be ice, but perhaps there was a place where he had broken it open, or maybe he had a well. She hesitated, reluctant to approach the cabin directly. The silence felt heavy, watchful. She knew she was being observed. The small window remained dark, but she felt his eyes on her. Gathering her courage, she walked slowly towards the cabin, her movements tentative. She stopped again near the door, uncertain how to proceed. Should she knock again? Wait? Beg? The door opened, as silently as it had closed the night before. Silas stood there again, filling the frame. This time, in the growing light, she could see him more clearly. He wasn't an old man, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and exposure. His eyes, when they met hers, were a piercing, unsettling blue, direct and unreadable. They held no warmth, no welcome, but also no immediate threat. His expression was neutral, stoic. He wore rough, dark clothes that blended with the landscape. He held a tin cup in one hand. Without a word, he extended it towards her. Alara blinked, surprised. She had expected silence, refusal, perhaps even hostility. Not this. She looked at the cup, then back at his face, searching for a reason. His expression remained impassive. It was a simple gesture, offering something she desperately needed. Hesitantly, she stepped forward and took the cup. It was warm, not hot, but warm enough to take the edge off the chill. She raised it to her lips and drank. It was water, clean and fresh, tasted like life. She drank it slowly, savoring it, feeling the warmth spread through her chilled body. When she finished, she lowered the cup, her eyes meeting his again. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger this time. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't invite her in. He didn't speak. He simply took the cup back and stepped back into the cabin, closing the door quietly behind him. It was another small, baffling act of, not kindness, not welcome, but a basic acknowledgement of her existence and need. It deepened the mystery of the man. He wasn't the monster of the stories, not in that moment. He was simply a man, living alone, offering a stranger a cup of water on a cold morning. It didn't erase the fear, but it complicated it. He was capable of something other than the cruelty she had been told to expect. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, casting weak golden light across the landscape, Alara felt a flicker of resilience stir within her. She had survived the night. She had received a small, unexpected aid from the feared man. The future was still uncertain, precarious, but for the first time in days, she didn't feel entirely hopeless. The world was still harsh, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to navigate it, even here on the edge of civilization, within the silent orbit of Silas. The sun rose higher, but offered little warmth. The air remained sharp, the ground hard as iron. Alara knew she couldn't linger. She had received a brief reprieve, a taste of water, but the underlying truth remained. She was a trespasser on the land of a dangerous man, with no resources and nowhere else to go. She needed to figure out what to do next. Leaving seemed the most sensible option, yet the sheer vastness of the plains stretched out before her, daunting and empty. Where would she go? How would she survive? She watched the cabin, the smoke still rising, a constant reminder of the life she was excluded from. She was hungry now, the initial fear giving way to the insistent ache in her stomach. She had her small bag of dried beans, but they needed cooking, and she had no fire, no pot, nothing but the frozen ground. A wave of helplessness washed over her. She had escaped one kind of death, only to face another, slower one out here. She sat near the lean-to, feeling utterly adrift. The silence of the morning was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. It was a silence that emphasized her solitude. After what felt like a very long time, the cabin door opened again. Alara tensed, her heart giving a familiar lurch of fear. Silas emerged, carrying a bucket and a shovel. He didn't look at her directly, his gaze fixed on the frozen creek bed. He walked towards it with a steady, purposeful stride, his movements economical and strong. He reached the creek and began chipping away at the ice with the shovel, his actions efficient and focused. It was hard work, the metal ringing against the frozen water. Alara watched him, fascinated despite herself. He was a man of action, not words. His silence felt less like intimidation now and more like a natural state, a reflection of the isolation he embraced. After a few minutes, he knelt down, scooping water into the bucket. He then stood, hefted the heavy bucket with apparent ease, and began walking back towards the cabin. As he neared, he glanced in her direction. It wasn't a direct look, more a brief, assessing sweep of his eyes. He didn't stop, didn't speak. He carried the water inside and closed the door. He was going about his daily routine, his life. Her presence was an anomaly, an inconvenience he hadn't actively removed. That was all. She needed to be proactive. She couldn't just sit there, waiting for him to decide her fate. But what could she do? She had nothing to offer, no skills that would be useful to a man living alone in the wilderness. Except, perhaps, the simple need for survival, the silent plea that she wouldn't be a burden, that she could somehow earn her keep, if he would allow it. But how could she communicate that to a man who barely spoke, who seemed to exist entirely outside the norms of human interaction? As she sat there, wrestling with her thoughts, the cabin door opened again. This time, Silas emerged carrying a small, dented pot. He walked over to a clear patch of ground near the cabin, set the pot down, and then went back inside, returning moments later with a small amount of firewood and tinder. He knelt and began building a small fire, his hands large but deft. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. He simply built the fire, placing the pot on a few stones over the nascent flames. Then he returned to the cabin one last time and came out with a small bag. He opened it and poured a handful of dried beans into the pot. He straightened up, brushed the dirt from his hands, and finally looked at her. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He didn't beckon her, didn't speak. He simply indicated the fire and the pot with a slight tilt of his head. It was an invitation, a silent, conditional invitation to share the warmth, to share the meager meal. It was another small act that chipped away at the feared image. This wasn't the action of a monster. It was the action of a man acknowledging another person's basic need. Still hesitant, but driven by hunger and a cautious curiosity, Alara slowly rose to her feet. She walked the short distance to the fire, her movements still stiff. She stopped near the fire, not too close to him, respecting the unspoken boundary. He was sitting on a log, watching the flames, his face relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before, the lines around his eyes softening slightly in the firelight. He didn't offer her a seat, didn't make conversation. He just let her be there. The warmth of the fire was a revelation, chasing away the deep chill that had settled in her bones. She held out her hands to the flames, feeling the heat seep into her skin. The scent of wood smoke and cooking beans filled the air, simple and comforting. It was the first moment of true peace she had felt in weeks. She sat down on the ground opposite him, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in silence, two solitary figures drawn together by the shared need for warmth and sustenance in a harsh world. The silence wasn't awkward or tense. It was simply quiet, punctuated by the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind. Alara stole glances at him, trying to read the man behind the legend. His profile was strong, his jaw set. He seemed entirely comfortable in the solitude, but perhaps not entirely content. There was a weariness about him, a deep-seated aloneness that she recognized from her own recent experience. The beans began to simmer in the pot, filling the air with their earthy aroma. It wasn't much, but it was food, offered by the man they called a monster. It was a turning point, however small. She was no longer just a trespasser seeking refuge. She was a temporary inhabitant of his space, sharing his fire, his food. It was a fragile connection, built on silence and necessity, but it was a connection nonetheless. The beans finished cooking, simple fare but nourishing. Silas retrieved 2 tin cups from the cabin and portioned the beans into them. He handed 1 cup to Alara without a word. She took it, her fingers closing around the warm metal. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling less strained this time. He gave another small nod, acknowledging her without looking directly at her. They ate in silence, the sound of their spoons scraping against the metal cups the only interruption to the quiet. The beans were plain, but they were warm and filling. Alara ate slowly, savoring every bite. Felt like a feast after days of hunger. When she finished, she set the cup down and looked at Silas. He was finishing his own, his gaze distant, fixed on the horizon. She wanted to ask him questions, so many questions, but the sparse nature of his communication intimidated her. Still, she couldn't sit in silence forever. She had to understand her position, what he expected. "Silas?" she ventured, using his name hesitantly. He turned his head slightly, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. They were surprisingly intense, thoughtful. "Why did you—" she started, then faltered. "Why did you help me?" The words felt presumptuous. He waited, silent. She took a breath. "Why did you let me stay? In the lean-to? And this?" She gestured to the fire and the empty cups. His expression remained neutral, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Something she couldn't quite name, perhaps reluctant recognition, or a weariness of the world that mirrored her own. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he looked away, his gaze returning to the distant mountains. The silence stretched, longer this time. Alara felt a familiar pang of frustration, the difficulty of communicating with a man who seemed determined to remain an enigma. Just when she thought he wouldn't answer, he finally spoke, his voice low, barely audible above the wind that had begun to pick up again. Didn't see the point of sending you back," he paused, as if weighing each word. Cold was coming. Wouldn't have made it, that was it. A simple, brutal assessment of her situation and his pragmatic decision. Not kindness, not pity, but a stark acknowledgement of reality. He hadn't wanted a death on his conscience, perhaps? Or perhaps he simply couldn't bring himself to condemn another living creature to freeze. It was a thin thread to grasp, but it was something. I have nothing to offer you," she said, stating the obvious truth of her predicament. "I can't pay you." He finally looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a hint of something other than stoicism in his eyes, a flicker of Understanding? Pity? Disdain? It was hard to tell. "Don't want coin," he said, his voice rough. "Don't need it, of course. A man who lived like this outside the world would have no need for money." "Then, what?" she pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want?" His gaze held hers, steady and unnerving. The silence returned, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alara felt exposed, vulnerable, waiting for him to name his price, to reveal the darkness she had been warned about. He shifted on the log, leaning back slightly. "Just peace," he said finally, his voice quieter. "Don't bring trouble." It was a simple demand, but loaded with implication. His peace, she suspected, was a fragile thing, constantly under threat. And her presence, no matter how quiet, was trouble by its very nature, an intrusion from the world he had left behind. "I won't," she promised, her voice earnest. "I just need a little time to figure things out, to get back on my feet." He didn't respond directly, just studied her face for a long moment. Alara felt a flicker of resolve harden within her. She wouldn't be a victim. She wouldn't be a burden. If he allowed her to stay, she would find a way to make herself useful, to prove that she wasn't the trouble he feared. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows. Silas rose from the log, his movements fluid despite his size. "Chores," he said, a simple explanation for his departure. He walked back towards the cabin, disappearing inside. Alara watched him go, the weight of his words settling upon her. "Don't bring trouble." It was a warning, a condition. Her survival here depended on her ability to be invisible, to be quiet, to not disrupt the solitary existence he had built. It felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. One wrong step, one misjudgment, and she could find herself cast back out into the wilderness, or worse. Yet the possibility remained. He hadn't said no. He hadn't demanded her departure. He had simply stated his condition. It was a precarious foothold, but it was a foothold nonetheless. She looked out at the vast, empty landscape, then back at the solid cabin. It was a place of isolation, of hardship, but it was also a place of survival. And perhaps, just perhaps, it could become a place of refuge for a little while. The silence of the plains wrapped around her, no longer feeling entirely hostile, but simply present. She was still afraid of Silas, yes, but the fear was intertwined now with confusion, with a grudging respect, and with a desperate hope that she could prove to him, and to herself, that she was worthy of the small corner he had allowed her. Days blurred into a rhythm of silence, cold, and cautious coexistence. Alara remained in the lean-to, respecting the invisible boundary around the cabin itself. Silas went about his tasks, chopping wood, mending fences she hadn't seen yet, checking traps, disappearing for hours into the vast territory. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was usually a single word or a short, practical phrase. Wood, water, food. He would leave a portion of his meals by the lean-to, often beans, sometimes dried meat, occasionally fresh kill from his traps. He offered no explanation, no conversation, just the sustenance she needed to survive. Alara, in turn, tried to make herself useful without being intrusive. She straightened the lean-to, collected kindling near her small space, mended tears in her own clothes with thread from her meager bundle. She wanted to show him she wasn't idle, wasn't just a drain on his resources. She wanted to prove she understood his condition. Don't bring trouble. She observed him constantly, learning his routines, the subtle shifts in his demeanor. He was a creature of habit, adapted to the harsh environment. His movements were efficient, quiet. He seemed to blend into the landscape, as much a part of it as the rocks and the wind. The fear of him slowly began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of awe and respect for his resilience, his self-sufficiency. He was not the monster of the stories, not in her experience. He was a solitary, capable man who had found a way to survive where others would perish. She saw the quiet weariness in his eyes sometimes, the deep aloneness that seemed to settle around him like a mantle. She recognized it because it mirrored her own. They were two solitaries, cast out by the world, finding a strange, silent refuge in each other's proximity. One afternoon, a harsh storm blew in, a furious onslaught of wind and snow that reduced visibility to mere yards. The lean-to offered little protection against the blinding snow and biting wind. Alara huddled inside, shivering violently, the cold seeping into her bones despite her efforts. She could barely see the cabin through the white curtain of the storm. The thought of staying out there through the night filled her with dread. She waited, hoping, praying, that he might offer her shelter in the cabin. The hours dragged by, the storm showing no sign of relenting. The lean-to groaned under the wind's assault. She was starting to lose feeling in her fingers and toes. Desperation clawed at her. She had to risk it. She had to ask. Struggling against the wind, she crawled out of the lean-to and fought her way towards the cabin door, the snow stinging her face like needles. She reached the door, raising a numb hand to knock. Before she could, the door opened, revealing Silas standing in the doorway, his face impassive, framed by the swirling snow. He looked at her, his piercing eyes scanning her frozen form. He didn't hesitate, didn't speak. He simply stepped back and gestured for her to enter. Relief washed over her so powerfully that her legs almost gave out. She stumbled inside, out of the storm, into the blessed warmth of the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, stew, by the scent of it. It was small inside, rustic but clean and orderly. A fire blazed in a stone hearth, casting flickering light and dancing shadows around the single room. A rough-hewn table and chair occupied the center, a bunk lined with furs against one wall. It was a simple, functional space, the home of a man who lived close to the bone. Silas closed the door, shutting out the fury of the storm. He still hadn't spoken. He gestured towards the fire. "Warm up," he said, his voice low but clear. Alara nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with cold and emotion. She walked towards the hearth, holding out her numb hands to the glorious heat. It was overwhelming, almost painful, feeling the warmth return to her frozen limbs. Silas moved silently about the cabin, adding more wood to the fire, stirring the pot hanging over the flames. He didn't hover over her, didn't make her feel like an intruder. He simply allowed her to be there, in his space safe from the storm. As the feeling returned to her hands, she looked around the cabin more fully. It was sparse, devoid of personal trinkets, but there was a sense of quiet strength about it, a reflection of its occupant. On a shelf, she saw a few worn books, a sharpening stone, some tools. On the wall, a rifle hung on pegs. Everything had a purpose. Silas scooped some stew into a bowl and placed it on the table. "Eat," he said, gesturing towards it. Alara walked to the table and sat down on the chair, her legs still trembling slightly. The stew was simple meat and root vegetables, but it was hot and fragrant. She picked up the spoon he had placed beside the bowl and began to eat. It was delicious, hearty, the kind of food needed to sustain life in this harsh climate. Silas sat opposite her, eating his own stew in silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the wind howling outside, and the quiet click of their spoons against the bowls. It was a strange, intimate moment, sharing a meal in the heart of the storm, two strangers thrown together by fate and the grudging grace of a feared man. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath her skin, but it was changing. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of the unknown. It was the cautious awareness of being in the presence of a powerful solitary force, a force that had chosen, for reasons she didn't fully understand, not to harm her. As she ate, she felt her strength slowly returning, not just physically, but emotionally. She had survived the night in the lean-to, survived the journey, survived the initial terror of meeting Silas. She was still here, and in the warmth of his cabin, watching him eat his meal in quiet solitude, she felt a fragile sense of hope blooming within her. She had found a temporary haven, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to understand the man who offered it. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was a profound sense of stillness. The warmth of the fire was a physical comfort, but sharing the space with Silas, even in silence, offered a different kind of solace. Alara finished the stew, feeling replenished and grateful. She looked across the table at Silas. He had finished eating and was now watching the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He seemed lost in thought, the usual stoicism softening around the edges in the firelight. For the first time, she felt bold enough to try and pierce the veil of his silence, not with questions about him, but about something more neutral. "It's a bad one," she said, referring to the storm. He nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the fire. "Worst this season," he rumbled, his voice a low sound in the quiet cabin. It was more than he had said at any one time before. Encouraged, she continued, her voice soft. "Thank you for letting me in. I wouldn't have made it." He finally looked at her, his blue eyes direct. There was no expression of needing thanks, no expectation. "Lean-to ain't meant for that," he said, a simple statement of fact. He wasn't acknowledging kindness, just practicality. The storm was too severe for the lean-to. His cabin was the only option for her survival. It was a perspective that was entirely Silas, stripped down to the necessary truth of the situation. She hesitated, then decided to try another topic. "How long have you been here?" she asked, gesturing around the cabin. He was silent for a moment, as if calculating or perhaps delving into memory. "Years," he said eventually. "Built it myself." That explained the sturdiness of the structure, the way it felt integrated with the land. He was not merely living on this land. He had carved his existence out of it with his own hands. It was an immense undertaking, a testament to his strength and determination. "It's a good cabin," she said, genuinely admiring his work. He gave another of his rare, small nods. The silence settled again, but it felt less like a barrier and more like a shared space of quiet contemplation. Alara felt a tentative connection forming, not through shared words, but through shared presence in the face of the storm. She looked around the cabin again, noticing the details of the smooth, worn surface of the table, the neatly stacked firewood, the absence of clutter. It was a life reduced to essentials, functional and self-sufficient. It mirrored the man. As the hours passed, the storm showed no sign of breaking. Silas banked the fire for the night. He gestured towards the floor near the hearth. "Sleep there," he said. Warmer than the bunk. He wasn't offering his own bed, which was fine, expected even. The spot near the fire was more than enough. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't reply, simply settled onto his bunk, turning his back to her. Alara lay down near the hearth, using her bundle as a pillow. The floor was hard, but the heat from the dying embers was a blessing. She watched Silas's broad back, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He was asleep within minutes, a man utterly at ease in his own space, even with a stranger present. Lying there, safe and warm, Alara reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. Cast out and facing death, she had found refuge with the most feared man in the territory. And he was not what the stories had made him out to be. He was silent, solitary, perhaps wary, but not cruel. He was a survivor like her, albeit on a different scale. The fear was still a part of her, a lingering shadow, but it was no longer the dominant feeling. Curiosity, respect, and a dawning sense of tentative trust were beginning to take its place. The storm outside continued its roar, but inside, protected by the thick walls of Silas's cabin and the quiet strength of the man himself, Alara finally slept, the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had had in weeks. It was a fragile peace, a temporary sanctuary, but for now it was enough. The night passed without incident. When Alara woke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Everything was coated in a thick blanket of pristine white snow, sparkling under the clear morning sky. The silence outside was absolute, muffled by the snow. Silas was already awake, adding wood to the fire. He glanced at her as she stirred. "Snowed in," he said, a simple statement of their situation. It was true. The snowdrifts outside were deep, making travel impossible, certainly for her, likely even for him without snowshoes. This meant she would have to stay longer. The thought brought a mix of trepidation and a strange sense of inevitability. She was trapped here with Silas, whether he liked it or not. He didn't seem bothered by it. He went about his morning routine as usual, boiling water for coffee. A small, unexpected luxury she hadn't seen him indulge in before. He poured a cup for himself and then, without a word, poured another and set it on the table. Alara rose, stretching her stiff limbs. The cabin was still warm. She walked to the table and picked up the cup of coffee, the heat seeping into her hands. She looked at Silas, who was sitting at the table, sipping his coffee, his gaze once again fixed on the fire. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded. The silence was comfortable this morning, companionable. She sat down opposite him and drank her coffee, looking out the small window at the snow-covered landscape. It was beautiful, pristine, but also daunting, a reminder of the isolation. She knew she couldn't continue simply accepting his charity. She had to find a way to contribute. Days turned into a week, then two, as the deep snow held the land captive. Alara settled into a routine within the confines of the cabin. She helped with the domestic chores, sweeping the floor, washing the few dishes in melted snow, keeping the fire going while Silas was outside attempting to clear paths or check traps closer to the cabin. He didn't ask her to do these things, but he didn't stop her. His silent acceptance was permission enough. She learned more about him through observation than through conversation. He was meticulous, orderly. His tools were always clean, his small stores organized. He read in the evenings by the firelight, his brow furrowed in concentration. She saw him handling a worn harmonica once, but he didn't play it, just held it for a moment before putting it away. It was a hint of a life beyond survival, a touch of something softer. He was physically powerful, but she also saw moments of quiet stillness, of reflection. The fear she had initially felt had almost entirely dissipated, replaced by respect and a growing ease in his presence. He wasn't the monster of the tales. He was simply a man who valued his solitude and his self-reliance above all else. She still spoke sparingly, matching his rhythm, but the silence between them was no longer tense. It was a shared quiet, two people existing together without the need for constant chatter. She started noticing the small things, the way the corner of his mouth would quirk sometimes when she managed to make the weak coffee taste halfway decent, the slight shift in his posture when he was listening intently even if he didn't respond verbally. One evening, while he was reading, Alara picked up her locket, turning it over in her fingers. It was a small, foolish thing to carry across the country, but it was a link to the past. Silas glanced up from his book, his eyes falling on the locket. "That yours?" he asked, his voice soft. It was the most direct question he had ever asked her about herself. She nodded, holding it out slightly. "It was my mother's," she said. "And then mine," she hesitated, then decided to share a tiny piece of her story, something she hadn't spoken aloud since she left her home. "It's all I have left of them. My family." Silas put his book down, his gaze steady on her face. He didn't offer platitudes or empty sympathy. He simply listened, his presence a quiet anchor. It was the first time she had truly felt seen, not just as a burden or an intruder, but as a person with a past, with loss. They made me leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the old pain raw. "After my husband died, there were whispers, judgments. They didn't want me there anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of rejection and betrayal. She expected him to ask for details, to pry, but he didn't. He simply nodded, his expression understanding in a way that surprised her. He knew about being cast out, about being judged. His own isolation was proof of that. He didn't ask what the whispers were about, what the judgments were. It didn't matter. What mattered was the consequence, being driven out. "Some places," he said finally, his voice rougher now, "ain't built for folks who are different, or who remind them of things they don't want to see." It was a profound statement, and it resonated deeply within her. Her situation wasn't just about her. It was about the community's discomfort, their fear of anything that disrupted their narrow view of the world. Yes, she agreed, her voice low. I was. Problem. So they solved it by making me disappear. He reached across the table, slowly, deliberately, and picked up the locket from her palm. He held it for a moment, his calloused fingers gentle against the delicate metal. He examined it closely, then looked at her again. They can make you disappear from their sight, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But they can't make you disappear. Not if you don't let 'em. He placed the locket back in her hand, his fingers brushing hers. The contact, brief and unexpected, sent a jolt through her. It was the most intimate interaction they had shared. His words weren't just comforting. They were empowering. They spoke to the core of her struggle, the fight not to be erased, not to let the world's judgment define her. He was telling her to hold onto herself, to the core of who she was, despite everything. In that moment, Silas wasn't just a man offering shelter. He was a fellow survivor, offering understanding and a quiet challenge to her despair. The fear she had once felt towards him seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude and a deepening, unspoken bond. The snow still lay deep outside, trapping them together, but the isolation inside the cabin felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. She looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw not the feared man of the territory, but a complex, solitary soul who had found his own way to survive, and who, in his own silent way, was helping her find hers. The barrier between them had begun to crumble, not with grand gestures or lengthy confessions, but with shared silence, small acts of necessity, and a brief, quiet moment of understanding over a simple locket. The snow finally began to melt, slowly at first, then with greater urgency as the sun gained strength. The paths became passable, the world outside the cabin opening up again. The time for Ilara to leave was approaching. The thought filled her with a complex mix of dread and resolve. She couldn't stay with Silas indefinitely, relying on his silent generosity. She had to face the world again to find her own way. But the prospect of being alone, truly alone, after weeks of quiet coexistence, was daunting. She had grown accustomed to his silent presence, to the routine of the cabin, to the strange sense of safety she felt under his rough protection. The fear of him was gone entirely now, replaced by a quiet respect and, she realized, a genuine fondness for the stoic, solitary man. She had seen beyond the legend, seen the man who built his own world, who read books, who offered coffee and stew, who understood what it meant to be an outcast. One morning, as the ground became firm enough for travel, Ilara knew the time had come. She had nowhere specific to go, no plan, just the vague direction of the nearest settlement, miles and miles away. She felt a lump form in her throat. How did she even say goodbye to a man of so few words? Did she just leave? That felt wrong. She owed him everything. She found Silas outside, mending a fence post near the cabin. He worked with his usual quiet efficiency. She walked up to him, her heart pounding. He stopped working, straightening up to face her, his blue eyes steady on hers. He seemed to know what she was going to say. Silas, she began, her voice a little shaky. The snow's melting. I need to be going. He didn't say anything, just watched her, his expression unreadable. I don't know how to thank you, she continued, gesturing vaguely. For the shelter, the food, everything. He shrugged slightly, a minimal gesture. Didn't do much, he rumbled. It was typical Silas, downplaying his own actions. He had done everything. He had saved her life. You did everything, she said firmly, meeting his gaze. You gave me a place when I had none. You kept me from freezing. He looked away then, towards the horizon, as if uncomfortable with her gratitude. World ain't easy out there, he said, changing the subject, his voice thoughtful. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the dangers she would face alone. I know, she replied softly. But I have to try. She waited, hoping he might offer some advice, some word of caution. But he remained silent, lost in his own thoughts. She felt a pang of sadness. The silence that had become comfortable now felt like a barrier again, a reminder of the fundamental solitude he inhabited, a solitude she couldn't truly penetrate. "Well," she said, taking a shaky breath, I should pack my things." Her things were still just the meager bundle. As she turned to walk back towards the lean-to, Silas's voice stopped her. "Wait!" She turned back, hope flickering in her chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He held it out to her. "Take this," he said. For the road, Ilara hesitated. She had said she had nothing to offer, couldn't pay him back. Taking something else felt like charity she hadn't earned. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I can't take more from you, ain't charity," he said, his voice firm. "Consider it payment." For keeping the cabin clean, it was a thin excuse, a generous lie, but she understood. It was his way of giving her help without making it feel like charity, preserving her dignity. She looked at the pouch, then at his face. His expression was serious, unwavering. She knew arguing would be futile. She reached out and took the pouch. It had a surprising weight to it. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Truly," he nodded, accepting her thanks this time. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "North Road," he said, pointing towards a barely discernible trail leading away from his hollow. "Nearest town is Willow Creek. Couple days' ride. Longer walk." He was giving her directions, practical, essential information. It was another layer of his quiet protection. He wasn't just giving her supplies. He was giving her a path. "Willow Creek," she repeated, filing the name away. "Thank you." For that too, he looked at her then. A long, steady look that seemed to encompass their entire time together. His blue eyes, no longer intimidating, held a quiet depth, a shared understanding forged in silence and hardship. He didn't smile, not even a hint of one, but his gaze was gentle. "Go careful, Ilara," he said, using her name. It was the first time he had used it, and it felt significant, a small acknowledgement of her as an individual, not just a presence. "I will," she promised, her voice barely a whisper. She wanted to say more, to express the profound impact he had had on her, the strength he had helped her rediscover, but the words wouldn't come, and perhaps they weren't needed. He understood. They understood each other in a way that transcended words. She clutched the leather pouch, feeling its weight, a tangible symbol of his unexpected aid. With a final, grateful look at Silas, she turned and walked towards the North Road, towards Willow Creek, towards an uncertain future. She didn't look back. She knew he was watching, a silent sentinel on the edge of his territory, the feared man of the territory. But she wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. He had given her more than shelter and food. He had given her back a piece of herself. As she walked, the landscape stretching out before her, she felt a quiet strength settling in her core. The journey ahead would be difficult, the world still harsh, but she was no longer the broken woman who had stumbled onto his land weeks ago. She was resilient, she was capable, and she carried with her the memory of a silent man in a cabin who had shown her that even in the most desolate places, connection and quiet grace could be found. Ilara walked for hours, the sun climbing high in the sky, the snow dampening the sound of her footsteps. The path was faint, little more than a deer trail in places, but it led generally north, just as Silas had indicated. The leather pouch felt heavy in her hand. Curiosity finally overcame her reluctance to open it. She stopped near a cluster of rocks, out of the wind, and carefully untied the thong holding it closed. She peered inside. It wasn't filled with coins, as she had half expected, but with something far more practical and, in its own way, more valuable. There were several nuggets of raw gold, dull and heavy, unmistakable in their worth. And beneath the gold, nestled amongst the soft leather lining, was something else, a small, folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. It was a rarity here, paper. She unfolded it carefully. It was a map, hand-drawn on rough paper, showing the trails, water sources, and approximate distances to settlements in the surrounding territory. Willow Creek was marked clearly, along with a few other locations, some circled, perhaps indicating potential dangers or resources. It was detailed, practical, a guide through the wilderness. And tucked into a corner of the map, written in a surprisingly neat hand, were just 3 words: for safe passage. Not payment, not charity. A gift, given with the clear intention of ensuring her survival. A means to navigate the dangerous world outside his protected hollow. Tears welled in her eyes, hot against the cold air. It was such a profoundly thoughtful gesture, so unlike the feared man of the stories. He had given her the means not just to survive the immediate journey, but perhaps to build a new life, far away from the judgments that had driven her out. The gold was more than enough to see her to Willow Creek and likely beyond, to get a start, to find work, to secure shelter. The map was a lifeline, a key to unlocking the wilderness. Silas had not only given her refuge, he had equipped her to face the world he had retreated from. She refolded the map carefully and placed it back in the pouch with the gold. She tied the thong shut, the weight in her hand now feeling less like a burden and more like a promise. A promise of a future, a chance to begin again. She looked back the way she had come. The ridge where Silas's cabin was hidden was no longer visible, lost in the vastness of the landscape. But she carried the memory of it within her, the warmth of the fire, the quiet strength of the man, the shared silence, the simple act of kindness that had changed the course of her life. He had not asked for her story, had not judged her, had simply offered the minimal grace of shelter, and then, when the time came, the tools she needed to move forward. The world had been cruel to her, but Silas, the feared man, had shown her a different kind of reality, one where quiet resilience and unexpected connection could bloom in the most unlikely places. She straightened her shoulders, a new determination setting in her jaw. She would use this gift wisely. She would honor his quiet generosity by surviving, by building something new. She was no longer the broken, fearful woman who had stumbled onto his land. She was stronger, more resilient, tempered by hardship but not destroyed by it. The solitude ahead was less terrifying now. She had a map, resources, and the quiet strength she had rediscovered in the presence of a man who lived outside the world's rules. He was the most feared man in the territory, yet he had met the one woman who, by the end, wasn't afraid of him, and in that meeting, both had found a quiet, unexpected piece of themselves. The journey to Willow Creek would be long and hard, but she faced it with a new sense of purpose. The wind still blew, the land was still vast and indifferent, but Alara was no longer adrift. She had found her footing, and she walked forward, towards the horizon, towards whatever lay ahead, carrying the quiet strength of the wilderness and the unexpected legacy of a man who had shown her that sometimes, the greatest safety could be found not in fearing the unknown, but in facing it with quiet courage. Her future stretched before her, uncertain but no longer hopeless. She had survived. She would continue to survive. The feared man had shown her how. Weeks turned into a month, then more. Alara reached Willow Creek, a rough-and-tumble settlement clinging to the edge of the territory. The gold Silas had given her was a fortune here, enough to secure a small, sturdy cabin of her own and buy the supplies she needed to start a simple life. She didn't reveal the source of her funds, allowing the speculation to swirl around her. She was used to whispers now. They held less power. The map proved invaluable, guiding her safely and allowing her to avoid treacherous routes. She found work sewing and mending, her quiet competence earning her a grudging respect from the few decent folk in town. She kept to herself, observing the dynamics of the settlement, careful not to attract unwanted attention. The lessons learned in Silas's cabin stayed with her, the value of quiet observation, of self-reliance, of finding strength in solitude. She thought of him often, wondering what he was doing in his isolated hollow. She never spoke of him, not wanting to draw any attention to his existence or their strange, brief time together. The legend of the feared man persisted in Willow Creek, stories told in hushed tones around fires, tales of violence and mystery. Alara listened to them with a quiet detachment, knowing they captured only a sliver of the truth, the part the outside world wanted to see. They didn't know about the silent man who shared his fire, who gave practical aid, who understood the pain of being cast out. Her own resilience grew with each passing week. The fear that had once been a constant companion had retreated, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had faced despair and survived. She had faced the feared man and found refuge. She was no longer defined by her past, by the judgments of others. She was defining herself step by step in this new place. One day, months after arriving in Willow Creek, a group of men rode into town, rough-looking and asking questions. They weren't from around here. Alara, keeping to the shadows of the boardwalk, listened intently. They were asking about the feared man, about Silas. They had heard tales of his rumored wealth, of gold found in his territory. Their questions were sharp, persistent, carrying an undercurrent of menace. They were the kind of trouble Silas had warned her about. Her heart pounded. They were looking for him. They were outsiders, bringing the world's greed and violence into his sanctuary. She felt an instinctual urge to protect him, to warn him. He had protected her. Now, perhaps, she could offer something in return. But how? She was just one woman in a small town, and they were armed, dangerous men. She retreated to her cabin, her mind racing. The map he had given her showed routes, trails only he and perhaps a few others would know well. It was a guide not just for her, but potentially for those seeking him. She had to hide it, keep it safe. The men stayed in town for a couple of days, their presence unsettling. They asked about anyone new, anyone who might have come from the direction of his territory. Alara kept her head down, her expression neutral, revealing nothing. She was a quiet woman, they were told, kept to herself. They didn't see the steel that had hardened within her. They eventually rode out, heading generally in the direction of Silas's territory, guided by the vague, fear-fueled directions of the townspeople. Alara watched them go, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. She knew the terrain better than they did, thanks to Silas's map. She knew how easily they could get lost, how dangerous the wilderness could be to those who didn't respect it. But she also knew Silas was capable. He was the feared man for a reason. He could handle himself. Yet, the image of those men, armed and dangerous, invading his solitude, disturbed her peace. She owed him. He had saved her. She couldn't just sit by and do nothing if there was a way to help, even from a distance. That night, Alara made a decision. She retrieved the map, studying it again. There was a route, a longer, more arduous one, that would loop around and potentially intercept the men, or at least allow her to get close enough to his territory to perhaps warn him. It was dangerous, perhaps foolish. She was not a frontierswoman, not a fighter, but she was resourceful and she was no longer afraid. Not of the wilderness, not of solitary men, not even of the judgment of others. She had been given a second chance, equipped by the very man these men sought to harm. She wouldn't stand by. She packed a bag with supplies, taking only what was essential. She had enough gold left to pay someone in town to look after her cabin. She purchased a sturdy horse, essential for covering the distance quickly. As dawn broke, Alara rode out of Willow Creek, not towards a new future, but back towards the past, towards the silent, solitary man who had given her refuge. She was going back to Silas, not out of fear, but out of a quiet strength and a debt she felt compelled to repay. The feared man had shown her how to survive, and now, perhaps, she could help him survive the world that had driven them both into the wild. The ride was hard, the wilderness unforgiving, but Alara faced it with a determination she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer running. She was riding with purpose, guided by the map and the quiet conviction that she was doing what was right. The feared man, she realized, was not just a legend. He was a person who had shown her kindness, and that debt transcended the fear he inspired in others. The journey back to Silas's territory was grueling, a test of endurance and will. Alara pushed herself and her horse, relying on the map and her burgeoning understanding of the land. She encountered no one on the trails, the vastness of the wilderness her only companion. She thought of Silas, his silent strength, his solitary life. The thought of those men, their greed and malice, seeking to disrupt his peace, fueled her urgency. She wasn't sure what she would do when she got there, how she would warn him, or if she would even be able to reach him before they did. All she knew was that she had to try. After days of hard riding, she reached the familiar ridge overlooking his hollow. She dismounted, leaving her horse tethered in a sheltered spot, and proceeded on foot, moving carefully, silently. She reached the crest of the ridge and peered down. The cabin was there, nestled in its protected spot. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life. But there were other signs too. Tracks in the mud around the cabin, too many for just one man. Boot prints she didn't recognize. A sense of dread settled in her stomach. They had found him. She crouched low, scanning the area. She saw 2 horses tethered near the lean-to, not Silas's horse. And she saw movement near the cabin door, 2 men, armed. They weren't Silas. They were the men from Willow Creek. She held her breath, listening. She could hear muffled voices, angry and demanding. Her heart pounded against her ribs. What was happening? Was Silas all right? She crept closer, using the sparse brush for cover. She could hear snippets of conversation now, shouts. They were inside the cabin. She couldn't hear Silas's voice. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her resolve. She was just one woman. What could she do against armed men? Fleeing was the sensible option. Getting involved was pure madness. But the thought of Silas, alone and facing these men, was unbearable. He had given her a chance when no one else would. She couldn't abandon him now. She thought about the map, the gold, the strength he had shown her. She owed him. She had to do something. She scanned the terrain, desperately looking for an advantage, a way to distract or deter them. There was a small storage shed behind the cabin, barely visible. It might contain something useful, or it might just be another dead end. Risking discovery, Elara circled around the hollow, keeping as low to the ground as possible, making her way towards the shed. The snow had melted, leaving the ground muddy and treacherous. Every snap of a twig, every displaced stone, sounded deafeningly loud to her ears. She reached the shed, a simple log structure with a heavy wooden door. It was unlocked. She slipped inside, the air musty and cool. It was filled with Silas's store's tools, sacks of grain, supplies, a couple of traps. Her eyes scanned the contents, searching for anything that might be useful. There was a coil of rope, a heavy axe, a kerosene lamp. Nothing that felt like a weapon. Then she saw it, tucked away in a corner, a box filled with blasting powder, likely used for breaking up rock or tree stumps. It was dangerous, volatile, but it could create a distraction. Or worse, a risky idea formed in her mind, born of desperation. She could use the powder to create a diversion, to draw the men out of the cabin, perhaps give Silas an opportunity. It was a long shot, incredibly dangerous, but it was the only possibility she could see. She wouldn't face them head-on. She wasn't Silas. But she could use the environment, use surprise. Clutching the box of powder, her hands shaking, Elara crept back out of the shed. The voices from the cabin were louder now, more agitated. She had to act quickly. She made her way silently to the back of the cabin, finding a spot near the stone chimney where she could place a small amount of the powder. She needed something to ignite it, something with a slow burn. She looked around frantically, her gaze falling on the kerosene lamp from the shed. Kerosene and powder, a dangerous combination. But timing was everything. She poured a small amount of powder near the base of the chimney, enough to create a flash and noise, not enough to bring the cabin down. Then, with trembling hands, she saturated a rag from her bag with kerosene from the lamp, creating a makeshift fuse. She placed the rag near the powder, ready to light it. She needed to draw their attention towards the front of the cabin first. Taking a deep breath, Elara found a loose rock and threw it hard against the side of the cabin, near the front door. The thud echoed in the hollow. Silence from inside. Then the cabin door burst open. One of the men, a hulking figure with a scowl, emerged, scanning the area, rifle in hand. "What was that?" he bellowed. His accomplice appeared behind him. This was her chance. Working quickly, Elara struck a match and lit the kerosene-soaked rag. It sputtered, then caught fire, the flame licking at the fabric. She nudged it towards the powder and scrambled away from the cabin, getting as much distance as she could, expecting an explosion. The rag burned, the flame creeping towards the powder. Alara scrambled back, heart in her throat, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The two men were scanning the front of the cabin, their attention focused away from the back. They hadn't seen her. The rag reached the powder. There was a flash of light, a muffled bang, and a cloud of dust and smoke erupted near the chimney. It wasn't a large explosion, but it was enough to be startling. "What the hell was that?" the first man yelled, spinning around towards the back of the cabin. Both men were momentarily distracted, their attention shifting to the source of the noise. In that critical instant, the cabin door flew open again, and Silas emerged, not through the front, but from a hidden side exit Alara hadn't known about. He moved with astonishing speed and quiet, a blur of motion. He didn't have a rifle, but he held a heavy axe, its blade gleaming in the afternoon light. He was upon the first man before he could fully react, the axe handle connecting with brutal force. The man crumpled to the ground with a grunt. The second man, startled and momentarily disoriented by the flash and the sudden attack, raised his rifle, but Silas was already moving, a force of nature unleashed. There was a brief, brutal struggle, a clash of bodies, the glint of metal. Alara watched, frozen, the sounds of the fight tearing through the quiet hollow. Silas was powerful, skilled, the feared man in action. The struggle ended as swiftly as it began. Silas stood over the two downed men, breathing heavily, the axe held loosely in his hand. He glanced around the hollow, his piercing blue eyes scanning the perimeter. His gaze swept over the area where Alara was hidden. For a terrifying moment, she thought he had seen her. Then, his eyes settled on the smoking spot near the chimney, the dust still settling. He must have realized what had happened, realized it wasn't just a random event, but something deliberate, something meant to help him. He stood there for a long moment, the axe still in his hand, the silent aftermath of the fight hanging heavy in the air. Alara remained hidden, unsure what to do next. The danger was past, for now, but seeing Silas like this, seeing the brutal efficiency of his actions, brought back a flicker of the old fear, tempered now with awe and a profound sense of relief. He was indeed capable of great violence, but he had used it to defend himself, his home. As he stood there, surveying the scene, Alara slowly rose from her hiding place. She couldn't remain hidden any longer. She had played her part. She walked towards him, slowly, her movements tentative. Silas turned as she approached, his expression shifting from the focused intensity of the fight to something unreadable as he recognized her. He lowered the axe slightly, but didn't put it down. She stopped a few yards away, looking at him at the scene of the confrontation. The two men were unconscious, perhaps worse. "Silas," she said, her voice quiet. I saw them in town. They were asking about you." "About gold," he nodded, his gaze steady on hers. "They found their way here," he said, his voice rough. He looked towards the chimney, then back at her. "That was you?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I had to do something," she whispered. They were looking for trouble." He was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face. Alara stood there, exposed, waiting for his reaction. Would he be angry that she had returned, that she had interfered? Would the feared man turn his focus on her now that the immediate threat was dealt with? But his expression wasn't angry. It was contemplative, perhaps even surprised. He had expected trouble from the outside world, but he hadn't expected help, certainly not from her. "You came back," he stated, not a question. "Yes," she confirmed. "You helped me." I couldn't just leave you to them." He finally lowered the axe completely, letting it rest against his leg. He looked at the two men lying on the ground, then back at Alara. A complex emotion flickered across his face, something akin to gratitude, mixed with the weariness of a man who had hoped his solitude would protect him from the world's ugliness. "Shouldn't have," he said, his voice soft now. Too dangerous, maybe, she replied, meeting his gaze. But I wasn't afraid, the words hung in the air. A quiet statement of truth. She had faced down her fear of him, faced down her own helplessness, and acted. He looked at her differently then, his eyes holding a new depth of understanding. The woman who had stumbled onto his land, broken and afraid, was gone. In her place stood someone resilient, capable, someone who had faced danger for his sake. The silence returned, but it was different now, filled with unspoken acknowledgement and a shared understanding forged in the crucible of conflict. He turned his gaze back to the unconscious men, the practical reality of the situation returning. Got to deal with this, he said, his voice returning to its usual low rumble. Alara nodded. She knew this was his domain, his problem to handle. But she also knew she wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not after this. She had come back and in doing so had crossed a threshold. The feared man and the woman who wasn't afraid of him stood together in the quiet hollow, the world's ugliness having intruded upon their peace, but their fragile connection having withstood the test. The wilderness that had once seemed purely hostile now felt like a shared space, defended together. In the aftermath, the quiet of the hollow settled once more, a fragile peace after the violence. Silas efficiently dealt with the unconscious men, securing them, his movements ungje and practiced. Alara watched him, the memory of his swift action still sharp in her mind. He was capable of great violence, yes, but it was a controlled force used with purpose. There was no cruelty in it, just grim necessity. He was not a monster. He was a man defending his home and his solitude. When he finished, he turned to Alara. The intensity of the fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by that familiar quietness. You should go, he said, his voice flat. Not a dismissal, but a statement of fact. The danger had passed. Her reason for being here was fulfilled. He expected her to leave now, to return to Willow Creek with her life and her secret safe. Alara hesitated. She had come back for him, faced danger for him. The thought of leaving now, of returning to her solitary life in town, felt wrong. Their paths had crossed again, not by chance this time, but by her deliberate choice. And in facing the threat together, something had shifted between them. I could help, she offered, gesturing vaguely to the scene. He looked at the bound men, then back at her. His expression was thoughtful. Ain't your trouble, he said. It is, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. They were looking for you because of the gold you gave me. Because you helped me. He was silent, considering her words. She was right. Her presence, her survival had indirectly led these men here. He had given her a piece of his world, and now, perhaps, his world had reached out and touched hers again. He looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers. Alara didn't look away. She wasn't afraid of him. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the weight of constant vigilance. He was alone, always alone, defending his peace. Why? He asked, his voice low, not asking why she had come back, but why she felt this responsibility, this connection. Because you are not the man they say you are, she said, her voice soft but firm. And because you saved me. When no one else would, he turned away then, walking towards the cabin. Get your horse, he said, his voice a little softer. Alara felt a pang of disappointment. He was still sending her away. She retrieved her horse from where she had left it tethered. When she returned to the hollow, Silas was standing by the cabin door. He wasn't holding the axe anymore. He was simply waiting. She approached him, leading her horse. Thank you, Silas, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. Again he nodded. He reached out a hand, not towards her, but towards her horse, stroking its neck briefly. It was a small, unexpected gesture of connection. He looked at her again, his gaze steady. Willow Creek ain't the only place, he said. It was a simple sentence, but loaded with meaning. He wasn't suggesting she stay with him, not explicitly, but he was acknowledging the possibility of her remaining in this territory, of not having to return to the world that had rejected her. It was an offer of proximity, of shared space in the wilderness. Alara understood. He wasn't asking her to live in his cabin, but he wasn't asking her to leave the hollow entirely either. He was opening a door, albeit a very small one, to the possibility of her remaining within the orbit of his solitary world. She looked around the hollow, the solid cabin, the protective ridges, the vast, wild land stretching out around them. It was a place of hardship, but it was also a place of freedom, of escape from judgment. And it was his place. Her gaze returned to Silas. His face was impassive, but his eyes held a quiet anticipation. She had come back to repay a debt, but perhaps she had found something more. A place where she belonged, not because it was given to her, but because she had earned her right to be there, by surviving, by helping, by not being afraid. "No," she said, her voice clear. "It isn't." She paused, then met his gaze fully. I could build a cabin. Up on the ridge. Out of your way, a small cabin, her own space, but close enough to be within the safety of his territory. Close enough for the shared silence, the shared existence." Silas looked at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, a subtle change came over his face. The lines around his eyes softened. The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly, in what might have been the hint of a smile. It was the first time she had ever seen him close to smiling. "Ridge is good," he rumbled, his voice lower than usual. "Can see the storms coming." It wasn't an enthusiastic welcome, but it was acceptance. It was an invitation, in Silas's own unique, understated language, to stay, to build her own life here on the edge of his world. Alara felt a sense of peace settle over her, deep and profound. She had found her place, not in the world she had lost, but in this wild, unexpected corner of the territory, with the man they all feared. She had come seeking refuge and found strength. She had faced a legend and found a quiet, complex soul. She was no longer the outcast. She was a woman building her own future, on her own terms, alongside a man who understood the true meaning of solitude and resilience. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the hollow. Alara stood beside her horse, looking at Silas, at the cabin, at the ridge where she would build her new home. The fear was gone. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to build, here, in the quiet strength of the wilderness, with the man who was feared by all, but who had met the one woman who was not afraid. And that had made all the difference. Their story wasn't one of grand romance or dramatic pronouncements, but of quiet resilience, earned trust, and a shared understanding that transcended words, built in the silence of the vast, unforgiving land. It was a story of two solitaries finding a fragile, powerful connection in a world that had cast them out, proving that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding unexpected light in the deepest shadows. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Alara didn't return to Willow Creek. She stayed in the hollow, still sleeping in the lean-to for a few nights, observing, preparing. Silas didn't rush her. He went about his routines, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence as something more permanent. He spoke slightly more often, offering observations about the weather or the tasks he was doing. He showed her where the best timber was for building, indicated the location of a natural spring higher up the ridge. He didn't build the cabin for her, but he provided the knowledge and the quiet support that made it possible. Alara worked hard, her hands growing calloused, her muscles aching. She learned to fell small trees, to notch logs, to lift and haul heavy loads. It was grueling, demanding work, but it was also deeply satisfying. She was building her own space, carving her existence out of the land, just as Silas had done. He would sometimes appear on the ridge, watching her work from a distance, a silent sentinel. Occasionally, he would come closer, offering a brief, practical suggestion, or simply working alongside her in companionable silence for a time, helping her lift a particularly heavy log, guiding her on a tricky joint. He never took over, never made her feel incapable, simply offered his strength and expertise when needed. The men who had come looking for him were dealt with in Silas's way, disappearing from the valley without a trace, their fate left unspoken between them. The incident served as a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked on the fringes of civilization, but it also solidified the unspoken bond between Alara and Silas. They had faced an external threat together, and in doing so had become allies, partners in navigating the harsh realities of their world. As the walls of her small cabin began to rise on the ridge, Alara felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was her home, built with her own hands, on land she had chosen, within the protective sphere of a man who had become her unexpected anchor. The fear of him was a distant memory, replaced by a deep, quiet trust. She saw him not as the feared man of the territory, but as Silas, solitary, capable, weary, and in his own way, profoundly decent. The silence between them was no longer a void to be filled, but a language of its own, filled with shared understanding, respect, and the quiet acknowledgement of their unique connection. They weren't a conventional couple, wouldn't likely exchange flowery words or grand declarations. Their bond was forged in hardship and silence, built on mutual respect and the simple fact that they had found a strange kind of peace in each other's proximity. She finished the cabin as summer settled over the plains. It was small, simple, but sturdy, a reflection of her own newfound resilience. It had a window facing east, catching the sunrise, and a hearth built of stone gathered from the ridge. It was hers. On the day she moved the last of her few possessions from the lean-to to her cabin, Silas came up the ridge. He didn't say much, just surveyed the finished structure with a critical eye. "Good work," he said finally, a rare compliment that meant more than any lengthy praise. Alara smiled, a genuine, uninhibited smile. "Thank you," she said. "I couldn't have done it without your help." "And your map," he nodded, acknowledging her words. He stood there for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping across the valley below, towards the distant, unseen world. Then he looked back at her, his blue eyes holding a quiet depth. "You're not afraid," he stated, a simple observation that encompassed their entire journey. "No," she agreed softly. "Not anymore," he nodded again, a sense of completion in the gesture. He had given her refuge, given her the tools to survive, and in return, she had shown him that his solitude didn't have to be absolute, that connection could exist even for a man like him, and she had proven that the world outside didn't have to break her. Their relationship wouldn't be one of grand gestures or romantic ideals. It would be built on shared silence, mutual respect, and the quiet presence of two resilient souls who had found their way to each other on the fringes of a world that hadn't wanted them. They were solitaries, yes, but they were no longer entirely alone. They were two cabins on a ridge, two lives intertwined in the vast, indifferent wilderness, finding strength and quiet companionship in their shared solitude. The feared man of the territory and the woman who wasn't afraid of him. Their story was a testament to the enduring power of resilience, the unexpected places where connection can be found, and the quiet dignity of building a life on your own terms, even when the world has cast you out. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. Alara stood on the porch of her new cabin, watching the colors fade. Silas was walking back down the ridge towards his own cabin, his figure silhouetted against the twilight sky. He didn't look back, but Alara knew he was there, a silent guardian in the valley below. She wasn't afraid of the coming night, or the vast wilderness, or the solitude. She was home, their lives settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. Alara lived in her cabin on the ridge, Silas in his below. They maintained their separate spaces, their solitude intact, yet their lives were woven together by proximity and the quiet understanding that had grown between them. They didn't visit each other daily. Sometimes days would pass without seeing one another, but the knowledge of the other's presence was a constant comfort. Alara continued to hone her skills, learning to hunt small game, to forage for edible plants, becoming as self-sufficient as Silas. He, in turn, would occasionally leave a larger kill, a deer or an elk near her cabin, a silent contribution to her larder. She would reciprocate by leaving mended clothes or a freshly baked loaf of bread. She had managed to acquire a small sack of flour near his door when she saw him leave the cabin. These were their exchanges, acts of quiet care and mutual support, requiring no words, only the unspoken language of their bond. The feared man of the territory remained a figure of legend in the distant settlements. His name spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. But to Alara, he was simply Silas, the silent, capable man who shared her corner of the world. She no longer saw the harsh lines of his face as intimidating, but as markers of a life lived fully, forged by the elements. His blue eyes held a depth of understanding that few people possessed. She saw the weariness, yes, but also a quiet contentment he hadn't had before she arrived. Her presence, her lack of fear, her quiet acceptance of him, had softened the edges of his solitude, not by intruding upon it, but by sharing it. One evening, as a storm rolled in, threatening rain and lightning, Alara saw Silas emerge from his cabin and look up at her cabin on the ridge. He didn't wave or call out, just stood there for a moment, a dark shape against the gathering storm clouds. Then he raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a simple, acknowledging gesture towards her cabin, a silent check, a reassurance of his presence, and perhaps, a quiet message of welcome to her home on his ridge. Alara stood on her porch, watching him, and raised her own hand in return. A mirrored gesture that spoke volumes without a single sound. They were two solitaries, standing in their separate spaces, connected by an invisible thread of trust and belonging. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Silas turned and retreated into his cabin. Alara did the same. She sat by her fire, the sound of the rain on the roof a comforting counterpoint to the crackling flames. She was safe, warm, and no longer alone in the world. The feared man was just down the hill, and he was her silent neighbor, her protector, her friend in the truest, most fundamental sense of the word. The world outside still held its dangers, its judgments, its cruelty. But here on the ridge, in her cabin, she had found peace. And Silas, the man everyone feared, had found a quiet companionship he hadn't known he needed, with the one woman who wasn't afraid to see him for who he truly was. Their story was not a fairy tale, but a testament to the strength found in unexpected connections, the resilience of the human spirit, and the profound grace of quiet understanding in a loud, fearful world. It was a life built not on societal expectations, but on shared survival, mutual respect, and the simple, powerful act of not being afraid. And that, she knew, was a stronger foundation than any the world could offer. She was Alara, a survivor, no longer an outcast, but a woman who had found her home in the wild, alongside the feared man, in the quiet language of two souls finding solace in each other's silent strength. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with loss and fear, but it had led her here, to this place, to this life, to this unexpected connection. She was where she was meant to be. As seasons passed, Alara and Silas continued their quiet, intertwined lives. They shared the bounty of the land and the challenges the wilderness presented. They spoke sparingly, their most important communications happening through actions and shared glances. Alara became a fixture on the ridge, her small cabin a beacon of quiet resilience. The legends of the feared man continued, but now they were just distant echoes to Alara, disconnected from the reality of the man she knew. Silas hadn't changed fundamentally. He remained solitary, capable, and wary of the outside world. But the edges had softened. There was a quiet ease in his presence, a warmth in his rare smiles that only Alara ever saw. They would sometimes sit together in the evenings, by his fire or hers, not speaking, just existing in comfortable silence. He would read, she would mend or sketch in a worn notebook. It was a profound companionship, built not on shared history or societal norms, but on mutual respect and the deep understanding that comes from facing hardship together and finding strength in each other's presence. They were a world unto themselves, two anchors in the vast, indifferent sea of the territory. Alara had not just survived. She had thrived. She was no longer the vulnerable woman seeking refuge. She was a strong, independent woman who had built her own life. And Silas, the feared man, had found a quiet solace he likely never expected, sharing his solitude with the woman who wasn't afraid of him. Their story was a quiet rebellion against a world that cast out those who didn't fit, a testament to the power of resilience and the unexpected places where connection could bloom. It was a life lived authentically, on their own terms, in the heart of the wild, proving that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't found in conquering the world, but in finding your own corner of it and sharing it with the one person who truly saw you. The years ahead stretched out before them, uncertain as always in the wilderness, but they would face them together, in their own quiet way, two solitary souls finding enduring strength and quiet dignity in their shared peace on the ridge. Their legend wouldn't be told in towns, but written in the land itself, in the sturdy cabins, the worn trails between them, the silent understanding between two people who had found home where they were meant to be, forged in the quiet crucible of the wild. The years continued their relentless march across the high plains. Alara's cabin on the ridge grew weathered, blending further into the landscape. Silas's remained below, a steadfast anchor. Their pattern of quiet coexistence deepened into a comfortable, unspoken partnership. They shared the labor of the seasons, preparing for winter, planting small gardens in the spring, preserving food in the summer, hunting in the fall. They relied on each other not with demanding need, but with a simple, acknowledged interdependence. Silas would mend Alara's roof when the wind tore shingles loose, or help her haul large stones for her hearth. Alara would tend to him if he was injured checking traps, her touch gentle, her silence as comforting as any words. The passage of time etched lines deeper into both their faces, signs of lives lived fully in the face of nature's indifference. The gold Alara had carried from Silas's pouch had long since been used, replaced by the true wealth of their self-sufficiency and the quiet strength of their bond. They spoke even less now, their understanding so profound that words were often superfluous. A shared glance across the distance, a nod, a simple gesture, these were their conversations. The feared man and the woman who wasn't afraid had built a life together, not in the conventional sense, but in a way that was uniquely their own, defined by mutual respect, shared hardship, and a deep, abiding connection forged in the heart of the wild. The world outside continued to exist, distant and mostly irrelevant. Occasionally, a rider would pass through the territory, skirting the known areas of Silas's land, carrying whispers of progress, of towns growing larger, of the wilderness slowly being tamed. But their hollow remained a sanctuary, a pocket of resistance against the encroaching world. Alara sometimes wondered about the life she had lost, the society that had cast her out. She felt no longing for it. Her life here, simple and hard as it was, felt more real, more honest, more fulfilling than anything she had known before. She had found her strength here, on the ridge, in the quiet company of Silas. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in glorious colors, Alara was sitting on her porch. She saw Silas emerge from his cabin and begin walking up the path towards her. It wasn't a time for chores or a need for a tool. He simply walked, steadily, purposefully, up the ridge. She rose and waited for him. He reached her cabin, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her, his blue eyes quiet and deep. There was something different in his gaze tonight, a reflection of the settling peace that had come with the years. He didn't speak for a long moment, just stood there, his presence a solid anchor in the vast landscape. Alara waited patiently, understanding that whatever he had to say, it would come in its own time, in its own way. The wind sighed through the sparse trees. A hawk circled overhead, a silent witness to their shared solitude. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice a low rumble, softer than the wind. "Good life," he said, his gaze sweeping across the hollow, the cabins, the land they shared. It was a simple statement, a reflection on the years, on what they had built together. Alara's heart swelled. It was perhaps the most eloquent thing he had ever said. "Yes, Silas," she replied softly, her voice filled with quiet emotion. A good life, he looked back at her, and in his eyes, she saw not the feared man, but the man she had come to know and respect, the man who had given her refuge and helped her find her strength. He took a step closer, and for the first time he reached out and gently took her hand. His calloused fingers were rough, but his touch was steady, grounding. It was a simple gesture, profound in its rarity and its meaning. It spoke of years of shared silence, of mutual reliance, of a bond that ran deeper than words. They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, two solitaries who had found a quiet, powerful connection in the heart of the wilderness, on the ridge they called home. They were not defined by the world's fear or its judgment, but by their own resilience and the enduring strength of a bond forged in silence and respect. The feared man and the woman who wasn't afraid, standing together as the stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky. Two quiet souls in a wild, beautiful world they had claimed as their own. Their story was a testament to the quiet dignity of a life lived authentically, the unexpected places where love, in its many forms, can be found, and the enduring power of human connection in the face of isolation. It was a legend written not in fear, but in the quiet strength of two people who had built a life together, side by side, on the edge of the world.